The fluorescent lights of the S4 conference room hummed with a monotonous, institutional buzz, a sound that Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova had long ago learned to tune out. It was a sound that belonged to spreadsheets, supply requisitions, and the slow, grinding machinery of keeping a Marine rifle company armed, fed, and equipped. It was not, in her opinion, a sound that paired well with talk of lightning warfare. Captain Jordan Struck, however, disagreed. He paced before the small gathering of his company leadership, his hands carving the air as he described the upcoming field exercise. He was a new sort of officer, forged in the crucible of a peacetime Marine Corps that desperately wanted to remember the ferocity of war. He was tall, with the oversculpted physique of a man who spent more time in the gym than on the range, and he spoke with the booming confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. "We're going to be fast, lethal, and completely self-sufficient for the first 72 hours, he declared, stabbing a finger at a topographical map taped to the wall. "Insertion via Hello here at LZ Crow. We push immediately to Objective Raptor, bypassing enemy strongpoints. Speed is security. Momentum is everything." Rostova remained still in her chair, her back straight, hands resting on the table. Her gaze was fixed on the map, but her mind was elsewhere, running calculations. LZ Crow was a high-altitude, single-ship zone. The push to Objective Raptor was 17 kilometers over broken, unforgiving terrain. The projected ammunition and water consumption rates were optimistic. Wildly so. First platoon will be lead element, carrying minimal gear. "We can't get bogged down," Struck continued, his enthusiasm filling the small room. Rostova waited for a pause. When it came, her voice was quiet, level, cutting through the captain's fervor not with volume but with clarity. "Sir, the CH-53s will be at max payload with personnel and initial ammunition loadout. There's no room for water resupply in the first wave. The forecast for that sector is 95 degrees with high humidity. By the time the company consolidates on the objective, we'll have Marines dropping from heat exhaustion before the first shot is fired." Struck stopped pacing. The energy in the room shifted, the air growing tight. He turned slowly, a condescending smile playing on his lips. He looked at her as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. She was the company logistics chief, a gunnery sergeant with 16 years of service, but in his eyes, she was just the woman who counted helmets and ordered boots. "Gunny," he said, the word drawn out. "You worry about the beans and bullets. I'll worry about the war fighting." "Got it." A few of the junior officers, including a fresh-faced second lieutenant named Hayes, exchanged small, knowing smirks. First Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a man whose face seemed carved from old leather and quiet disappointment, remained impassive, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. Rostova's expression didn't change. She held the captain's gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable for him, a silent challenge that he didn't quite understand. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. "Aye, sir." She didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. She didn't need to. The plan was flawed. The captain's ego was writing checks the company's bodies would have to cash. Her job was to mitigate the damage. Back in her office, a caged-in space at the back of the supply warehouse, the world returned to order. Here, there was no room for ego or flawed assumptions. There was only data. Stacks of maintenance reports, inventory manifests, and consumption logs stood in perfectly aligned towers on her desk. The air smelled of canvas, cardboard, and gun oil. Rostova moved through the space with an economy of motion that bordered on ritual. She cross-referenced the field exercise order with the current company readiness reports. The numbers told a story the captain refused to read. 3 of the company's 7-ton trucks had overdue services on their transmissions. The water purification unit was running at 70% efficiency. The number of heat casualties in training over the last month was already 20% above the battalion average. Captain Struck had a fixation. He called it warrior ethos, but Rostova recognized it for what it was: a deep-seated insecurity masked by performative aggression. His primary tool for instilling this ethos was the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, or MCMAP. He was a certified black belt instructor, a fact he mentioned at every opportunity. Company physical training sessions had transformed from standard runs and conditioning drills into brutal, full-contact sparring sessions. He would stride among the grappling Marines, shouting encouragement that sounded more like insults, his chest puffed out. Rostova observed it all from a professional distance. She saw the results in her requests for medical supplies, triple the usual number of compression wraps, ice packs, and athletic tape. She saw it in the faces of the young Marines who came to her warehouse to swap out gear, their movements stiff, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. They were being worn down, not built up. One afternoon, she found First Sergeant Thorne standing outside the armory, watching the captain demonstrate a chokehold on a reluctant corporal. Struck was sloppy, using more muscle than technique, his face red with exertion. "They're going to be broken before they ever see a deployment," Rostova said, her voice low. She didn't need to look at Thorne to know he was listening. Thorne sighed, a sound like gravel shifting in a deep pit. "He's got something to prove, Gunny. Thinks a tab from the instructor course makes him a sensei." "He's teaching them bad habits," she stated flatly. "He's leaving their backs exposed on the follow-through. He's putting too much pressure on the windpipe instead of the carotid arteries. It's inefficient and dangerous." Thorne turned to look at her, a flicker of surprise in his old eyes. "You know your way around the program." "I'm familiar with the material," Rostova said, her tone giving nothing away. She held up a clipboard. "First Sergeant, I need your signature on the Consolidated Shortage Report. We're still missing 12 serviceable flak jackets from the last field op." The conversation was over. Thorne signed the form, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. He had seen glimpses of it before, the unnerving stillness she possessed, the way she could command a room of unruly lance corporals with a single quiet word, the analytical precision she applied to every task. He'd always chalked it up to her being a damn good logistics chief. Now he wasn't so sure. He was starting to think there was a whole other story there, one she had no intention of telling. The pressure continued to build. The captain's obsession grew. He announced a company-wide MCMAP belt test, to be held at the end of the week. It wasn't optional. Everyone, from the newest private to the company executive officer, would participate. It was, he declared, a final test of their warrior spirit before the big exercise. The day of the test arrived with a brassy, unforgiving sun that beat down on the vast expanse of the main parade deck. 350 Marines from Echo Company stood in loose formations, the air thick with the smell of sweat and sun-baked asphalt. Captain Struck stood before them, wearing a black belt over his utility trousers, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was in his element. This was his theater. He began with a speech, a rambling monologue about pain, sacrifice, and the difference between sheep and sheepdogs. Rostova stood in the back with the other staff NCOs, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't participating in the belt tests. Her role was supervisory, ensuring water was available and the corpsmen were on standby. She had already treated 2 Marines for dehydration before the captain had even finished his speech. "The only way to know your limits," Struck boomed, his voice echoing slightly across the deck, "is to push past them. The only way to master fear is to face it. The only way to master combat is to engage in it." His eyes scanned the formation, looking for a focal point, for a teaching moment. And then they found her, Gunnery Sergeant Rostova, standing there, calm and unaffected, the logistician, the woman who had questioned his plan, the perfect symbol of the non-warrior, the support element he felt was holding his company back from true greatness. A wicked idea, born of ego and a desire for public dominance, bloomed in his mind. "Gunnery Sergeant Rostova," he barked. A ripple went through the formation. Heads turned. Rostova didn't react, her posture unchanged. "Front and center, Gunny." First Sergeant Thorne stiffened, taking a half-step forward as if to intervene. Rostova silenced him with a glance, a look so steady and certain that the old First Sergeant stopped cold. With deliberate, unhurried steps, She walked from the back of the formation and came to a halt 10 feet in front of the captain. The silence on the parade deck was now absolute, broken only by the distant whine of a jet and the flapping of the flag on the distant pole. "We're going to do a little demonstration," Struck said, his voice dripping with condescension. He began to circle her like a predator. "Sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that are hands-on. I'm going to show the company a simple, effective takedown. A compliant versus non-compliant subject." He grinned at his Marines. "Don't worry, Gunny. I'll be gentle." Rostova stood as still as a statue, her hands held loosely at her sides. Her face was a neutral mask, but her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. She assessed his stance. Feet too wide, weight too far back on his heels. She noted the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor of adrenaline in his hands. He was broadcasting all of his intentions. "All right, Gunny," he said, stopping in front of her. "What's the matter, Gunny?" he taunted. "Stage fright." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the junior ranks. Lieutenant Hayes watched with a pained expression, sensing this was a terrible mistake. "Come at me," the captain ordered, his voice taking on a harder edge. His patience was wearing thin, his ego pricked by her silent defiance. This wasn't how the demonstration was supposed to go. She was supposed to be flustered, intimidated. Rostova remained planted. She would not be the aggressor. She would not initiate. That was not her way. For the 350 Marines watching, it was as if time itself stuttered. One moment the captain was a charging bull. The next he was flying sideways. Rostova didn't retreat. She didn't tense. At the last possible second, she moved. It wasn't a block. It was a redirection. She pivoted on the ball of her left foot, her body flowing away from his line of attack. Her right hand came up, not to strike, but to gently cup his advancing elbow. Her left hand met his hip. It was a movement of sublime, almost delicate precision. She used his own momentum, his own mass and velocity against him. He stumbled, his feet tangling, and crashed to the deck in a heap of limbs and wounded pride. A collective gasp went through the company. It was a sound of pure shock. Struck scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of crimson fury and humiliation. He had tripped. In his mind, she hadn't done anything. He had simply tripped. "You got lucky," he spat. Her left forearm rose, deflecting the blow not with a hard block but by meeting the inside of his bicep, disrupting the entire kinetic chain of the strike. The punch veered harmlessly off course. In the same seamless motion, her right hand clamped onto the wrist of his punching arm, while her left hand slid up to brace the back of his triceps, locking his arm in a straight, rigid line. She now had complete control of his right side. He was locked out, his balance compromised, his center of gravity hers to command. He tried to pull away, but it was like trying to pull his arm out of a steel vise. Her grip was absolute, not because of strength, but because of perfect skeletal alignment and leverage. The parade deck was dead silent. Every Marine watched, mesmerized. They were seeing something they didn't understand. This wasn't a brawl. It was a masterclass. It was physics and biology applied with terrifying grace. "Let go of me," Struck grunted, trying to wrench his arm free. Rostova didn't respond. She simply applied a slight, almost imperceptible downward pressure on his locked elbow, a pressure that threatened to hyperextend the joint. A spike of pure, white-hot pain shot through the captain's arm. He gasped, his resistance faltering. She used his pained reaction to transition. In a single, fluid motion, she released his arm, spun under it, and established a rear clinch, her body pressed against his back. One arm snaked across his chest. He was bigger, stronger, but it didn't matter. She was controlling his posture, his breathing. He was a puppet, and she was pulling the strings. "Had enough, sir?" she asked, her voice a calm, level whisper directly in his ear, meant only for him. It was the worst thing she could have said. His pride, already shattered, ignited into pure rage. He let out a primal roar. "I'm the combat master." He exploded backward, trying to crush her against him, to use his superior weight to break her hold. It was a desperate, brutish move, and it was exactly what she was waiting for. As he drove his weight back, she didn't resist it. She accepted it. She dropped her own center of gravity, sinking low and turning her hips into him. She hooked her right leg behind his, her foot planted firmly on the deck. It was a perfect textbook ogashi, a major hip throw. His backward momentum became a forward, downward spiral over the fulcrum of her hip. For a brief, terrifying moment, Captain Jordan Struck was completely airborne, parallel to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then gravity reasserted itself. He hit the asphalt with a sound that was both a wet smack and a deep, resonant thud. The impact knocked the air from his lungs in a single, explosive gasp. His head bounced once, a sickening crack that echoed across the silent parade deck, and then he was still. A cold silence, a profound, ringing silence fell over the 350 Marines of Echo Company. They stared, first at the motionless form of their commander, and then at the woman standing over him. Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova stood breathing evenly, her posture perfectly balanced. There was no triumph on her face, no anger, no satisfaction. She simply looked down at the man on the ground. Then, with the same calm deliberation she applied to everything, she knelt beside him. Her fingers went to his neck, checking for a pulse. Strong and steady, she tilted his head back, ensuring his airway was clear. She noted the fixed, glassy look in his eyes, a classic sign of a concussion. With practiced efficiency, she rolled him onto his side into the recovery position. Her movements were not those of a victor. They were the detached, clinical motions of a first responder. The company was frozen, a sea of statues in camouflage. They had just witnessed the complete and total dismantling of their commander, a man who built his entire identity around his supposed martial prowess. And it had been done by the quiet logistics gunny, a woman they barely noticed, a woman who had never raised her voice or boasted of her skill. It was more than a physical defeat. It was the annihilation of an entire persona. Into the stunned silence, a new sound emerged, the steady, rhythmic cadence of boots on asphalt. First Sergeant Marcus Thorne strode into the center of the circle that had formed. He didn't spare a glance for the unconscious captain. His eyes were on Rostova. He saw no emotion in her, only a quiet professionalism that was more intimidating than any war cry. He turned his gaze from her to the sea of shocked faces. He scanned them all, the wide-eyed privates, the stunned corporals, the pale and shaken Lieutenant Hayes. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the weight of iron and years. It cut through the silence and commanded absolute attention. "Eyes!" he barked, the single word cracking like a whip. 350 pairs of eyes snapped to him. "You are all witnesses," he began, his voice low and hard. "You did not just see a fight. You just received the most important lesson on leadership you will ever get in your careers. You saw the difference between authority and competence, between bluster and mastery." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the still form of Captain Struck. "That is what happens when ego writes a check that skill cannot cash." Then he turned his hand, palm open, toward Rostova, who was now rising slowly to her feet, dusting off the knees of her trousers. "And this," he said, his voice dropping with a tone of profound respect, "is what real mastery looks like. Let me tell you who you've been taking for granted." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, letting them absorb the magnitude of what they had just seen. "That is Gunnery Sergeant Rostova." Before the Marine Corps decided it needed her brilliant mind to fix its broken logistics chain, she served 6 years as a lead instructor at the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program Center of Excellence at Quantico. A wave of murmurs swept through the formation. Quantico, the Center of Excellence. That was the source, the fountainhead of all MCMAP training. Thorne wasn't finished. He raised his voice to cut through the noise. She didn't just teach black belts. She wasn't just an instructor. She was an instructor trainer. She certified the master instructors who go out and certify people like Captain Struck. She holds a 5th-degree black belt in MCMAP. She helped write the book. Literally. She was the lead curriculum developer for the Close Quarters Combat Integration course for Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. The murmuring died instantly, replaced by a silence of pure, unadulterated awe. MARSOC, the special operators, the elite of the elite. They had a living legend stocking their supply cages, and they had never even known it. She has forgotten more about fighting than any of us will ever know, Thorne concluded, his voice ringing with finality. She has earned the right to be quiet. The rest of you would do well to learn from that. He looked directly at Lieutenant Hayes, whose face was ashen. The young officer's posture had changed. The casual arrogance was gone, replaced by a rigid, humbled attention. He looked at Rostova not as a staff NCO, but as something else entirely, something far beyond his comprehension. The respect was instantaneous, palpable, and absolute. The entire culture of the company had been rewritten in the space of 90 seconds on a hot parade deck. The wail of a siren grew louder, and a military ambulance pulled up to the edge of the formation. 2 Navy corpsmen jogged out with a stretcher. Rostova met them, giving them a calm, concise report. Adult male, approximately 200 pounds. Witnessed loss of consciousness following a hard fall. Impact to the occipital region of the skull. Unconscious for approximately 2 minutes. Pulse is 68 and strong. Respirations are even. No visible bleeding. Her terminology was precise, her delivery flawless. She was once again the comm center of the storm, the professional handling a problem. The corpsman loaded the captain onto the stretcher. As they carried him away, his eyes fluttered open. He was groggy, confused, a sheen of sweat on his pale face. His gaze fell on Rostova, and in his eyes, there was no longer any arrogance. There was only a dawning, horrified understanding. First Sergeant Thorne stared at the assembled Marines. Get back to the barracks. Hydrate. The rest of the day's training is cancelled. Dismissed. The company broke apart, not with the usual loud shouts and horseplay, but in quiet, subdued groups. They moved with a new gravity, their conversations muted, their eyes constantly drifting back to the lone figure of Gunnery Sergeant Rostova, who now stood alone in the center of the vast, empty parade deck. She watched the ambulance drive away, her expression giving nothing away. Thorne walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You good, Gunny?" he finally asked, his voice softer now. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. A single, almost imperceptible nod. "First Sergeant." It was all that needed to be said. He nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of a shared truth, and walked away, leaving her to the silence and the sun. She stood there for another minute, letting the adrenaline ebb from her system, feeling the heat of the asphalt through the soles of her boots. The incident was an anomaly, a messy, unfortunate deviation from the ordered world she preferred. It was a problem that had presented itself and a problem that had been solved. Now there was work to do. An hour later, Gunnery Sergeant Rostova was back in her domain. The chaotic energy of the parade deck was a world away. Here, under the steady, humming glow of the warehouse fluorescence, there was only logic and order. The air still smelled of canvas and CLP, a comforting, familiar scent. She walked past rows of shelving stacked high with gear, her eyes scanning for imperfections. She noticed a pallet of ammunition cans that was stacked one box too high, a violation of safety regulations. With a quiet word to a nearby lance corporal, the issue was corrected. She saw a young Marine struggling to properly configure the straps on a new pack. She didn't lecture him. She simply walked over, took the pack, and with a few deft, efficient movements, adjusted the straps to perfection, showing him how to distribute the weight properly across his hips and shoulders. The young Marine, who had been present on the parade deck, could only stammer a thank you, his eyes wide with a reverence he hadn't possessed that morning. Rostova merely nodded and continued her rounds. Her world was one of small, crucial details: inventory numbers, maintenance schedules, the tensile strength of nylon webbing, the proper humidity for storing sensitive electronics. These were the things that kept Marines alive, far more than any amount of screaming or bare-knuckle sparring. This was her form of combat, a quiet, relentless war against entropy, chaos, and institutional neglect. She returned to her caged-in office and sat down at her steel desk. The paperwork from the morning was still there, waiting, but she ignored it for a moment. She opened a small drawer and removed a personal toolkit. From it, she selected a small, needle-nosed pair of pliers and a bottle of lubricant. She picked up a standard-issue rifle sling from a repair bin. It was a simple piece of gear, but it was vital. A frayed sling could mean a dropped rifle in a critical moment. She found the spot she'd noticed earlier, a single thread on the edge of the webbing that had begun to unravel. With the meticulous focus of a surgeon, she worked. She carefully rewove the loose thread back into the webbing. She applied a single, tiny drop of sealant to secure it. She worked the buckle, ensuring it moved freely but held tight under pressure. The entire process took 5 minutes. When she was finished, the sling was perfect. Stronger, more reliable. It was a small act, one that no one would ever notice or comment on. There would be no award for it, no public recognition. It was simply the work. She placed the repaired sling in the outbound bin and cleaned her tools, placing them back in their case with quiet precision. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady, monotonous tune. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the base. Another day was ending. For Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova, the quiet professional, the master of her craft, the work continued. And it was good.